Good evening. This is Extract. Well, I must say today is indeed really brief and a bit. Poor Pope. Poor Pope Francis. He now has the opportunity, of course, to personally realize that all this fuss with crosses, outfits, cathedrals, candles, buns in general was completely in vain. It's a pity. Of course, it's terribly sad to upset the old man, especially since, as it turned out, he secretly donated to the SOU, but nothing else except necrosis and necrobiosis, the afterlife, could be offered to a person. I must say the Pope in general was honestly warned about this by any textbook of physiology, physics, biochemistry, but back then he didn't listen. However, in general, the sadness about Pope Francis is already dissipating. He's no longer the topic. The topic is fading away. Although the sadness was quite real, it wasn't a sharp sadness. In the West, no one was weeping, tearing their clothes, or overturning ashtrays on their heads. But nevertheless, the sadness was quite noticeable. And it's noticeable that the Catholic Church, but as I already mentioned, there was no gloating at all. In this regard, it's worth imagining the upcoming funeral of Gundyaev. The Russian Orthodox Church will also become widowed, and it will show what a merry widow it can be, just like in that great operetta of the same name, with banquets, songs, drinking bouts, and dances. Gunya is so greedy, cunning, and malicious that they will send him off to his blessed necrosis, hiding smiles in their beards, probably all 40,000 priests and bishops of Russia. But the new patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church will be no better. Gundyaeva, by the way, the true reasons for Minister Belousov's applause have become known. Attempts to dig himself out of his bureaucratic coffin. Shoy. The fact is that Putin whispered to Gundyaev in his cold ears. Belousov had the imprudence to bring the relics of Matrona of Moscow to the forefront for a wide tour and prayer services in Syria. And the vehicle that was transporting these relics, of course, was hit by a shell, and everything was blown to smithereens. The car, the crew, and Matrona disappeared without a trace. And so, as they say, all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot. Put Humpty together, Humpty Matrona back together. Nowhere. They searched everywhere. But what didn't burn was scattered so widely and far that by the 10th day, the search for Matrona's remains was deemed pointless. And if Suvorov, in a similar situation, lost only a leg and part of his skull in the special military operation, and the rest of his skeleton was somehow patched together with duct tape and sent back into the fray, then from the touring relics of Matrona, nothing at all remained. Well, some parts of the blessed old woman are still there, of course, in the Moscow monastery, but the majority is irretrievably lost, and this enraged Gundyaev. Don't forget that any relics are a source of income for him. That's why there was a crackdown on Belousov. But today's events have puzzled everyone to some extent with the blackout in Spain, Portugal, and parts of France. And it was very serious there. It's being restored now, but entire cities were plunged into darkness. Metro trains stopped. It was impossible to contact loved ones because everyone, of course, had dead phones that couldn't be recharged. There is no clear explanation for this blackout yet. But it is quite possible that this short circuit has not a mysterious atmospheric, but rather a distinctly Moscow origin. Because if you see some kind of mischief, the word Moscow should be the first word that comes to mind. And the understanding of the eternity of war likely provokes Russia to flex its bloody fingers anywhere, really. And here, for the time being, all these power lines, Europe expected to live long and happily and did not think that its life would ever be overshadowed again. And here, all of this is generally defenseless. Now, probably everything will be different. Trump, 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 Trump in sorrow. The fact is that the main parrot, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, he, somewhere, cleaned his claws and beak, and again, Trump is getting on nerves. This parrot is again repeating Putin's delusional and unrealistic conditions for peace, just like a year ago, as if nothing happened. There it started with 4 regions, 4 regions, 4 regions, Crimea, ours, no NATO, and so on, continuing with Putin's list. And Trump is approaching 100, Trump is nearing a little anniversary, the 100th day of his presidency, by tradition for Americans. It's a big, important milestone date, which shows what the president is capable of. And in general, somehow, he will have nothing to mark this 100 days with, nothing but chaos and fantastic noise in the world. Well, it can be considered his serious internal victory. This is what he did, made the American spirit great again, increased by, but yes, no, of course, Trump has shown that he knows how to create incredible domestic political noise and foreign political noise. He's like a sperm whale. He's a man Krakatoa. Krakatoa, if you remember, was a volcano whose eruption was heard 5,000 kilometers away. Well, in general, aside from the spirit, Trump, appearing in a blue suit, he managed to make the Pope's funeral great again. Because if it weren't for Trump, not for Zelensky, not for the concentration of all international passions, then all these funeral events in Rome would have remained purely a church affair among themselves. But the appearance of Trump in the cathedral, such an appearance that even the deceased retreated to the far corner of the coffin, was, of course, extraordinary. And if Jesus was observing this scene, he must have taken note that arranging his second coming, where they are expecting Trump, is a trivial and misguided endeavor. I'll whistle, and you'll ask to move aside so as not to block old Donald. But despite all the grandeur and the tremendous noise in the world, the Kremlin, sly and vile, continues to mock good guy Trump, and it does so in a sophisticated and successful manner. Of course, various negotiators are bustling about. Official Washington assures that the long-awaited military political miracle is about to happen. Look, here it is. Pants turn into an elegant world. Expressions of confidence, concerns, and forecasts are made. But it's clear that any peace treaty projects are worth no more than, I published on my Telegram channel, take a look. It's extremely an intriguing document. In my opinion, it hasn't been particularly, let's say, well known. It's a document retrieved from the Titanic. And on these pages, it is written, "We will arrive in New York on Wednesday." This was written a day before the disaster. But apparently, even a pause in the war is also awaiting the fate of the Titanic. including the authoritative, importantly, Republican John Kennedy, tried today to bring Trump back to reality again. He delivered a brilliant speech explaining that yes, indeed, Putin is mocking. Putin will wage war forever. Putin is holding the president of the United States for a fool. And Kennedy, said that we must make it clear to Putin that we are ready to turn him into feed for. He even specifically mentioned him and his country. Of course. This statement by Kennedy, a senator from the Republican Party, raises justified concern for the fate of the fish. But not everything is so favorable, knowing, or in the world ocean too. Poison or doom to gastrointestinal torment. Even one of the existing species of fish, and fascist Russia under Putin is a toxic and completely unsanitary product. Look at the faces of the State Duma deputies. Well, it really is absolute poison. And Senator Kennedy doesn't think about what the taste of the soup might become as a result. He probably doesn't care that for several decades, until the ecosystems are restored, people will have to forget about French fish soups and other top dishes. Of course, there are, but let's be honest, there are species that can digest without consequences for themselves. Even Milonov, Matvienko, Volodin, and all the other orcs with their values. Those fish. Such cute ones like the anglerfish. There are goblin sharks, but these are inhabitants generally of the deep sea. And the populations of these fish are not large enough to completely eliminate this two-headed threat to humanity. We see that Putin is demonstrating a physiological need. And to continue the war, to splash in blood, to dismantle, destroy, and occupy. And an excellent marker of his intentions to continue the war is how consistent he is, and vile in escalating the internal Russian military hysteria and in crushing any dissent within the country. He is steamrolling the Russian consciousness, the Russian mind, striving for the complete, total, absolute eradication of any independent thought. And Russia, it must be said, is indeed obediently developing in this direction. The Kremlin has given the Russian people the freedom of cannibalism, and the people are absolutely thrilled. All Gestapo-like behavior in Russia has become a household norm, and calls for the destruction of neighbors are media standards. Well, listen, on my Telegram channel, some other schizoid, as far as I understand, it seems to me that quite an official propagandist insists that the population of Odessa must be completely destroyed because they are not zealously enough, hindering the armed forces of Ukraine from waging war. But in general, in the official media of the Russian Federation, it is very difficult to find journalists who are not currently savoring the total extermination of the people of Odessa or Kharkiv. You can see the idiots on my Telegram channel. Well, it's a masquerade show. They have become much more creative during raids and searches. Now, they not only break the fingers of political prisoners, but also cut them off with scissors. At least they try. Not everyone has scissors that are properly prepared and sharpened. And they are now using stun guns not only on free thinkers, but also on their elderly way and underage household members. A shock to the eye or throat is received from law enforcement by the elderly as well. Well, like it happened in Voronezh on April 22nd during a search at Fyodor Orlov's place, an anti-war activist. And the bailiffs, without even waiting for any verdicts, beat up suspects and their lawyers right in the courtroom. In the corridors of the court. And this video from the Basmani court is also posted on my... The problem with all these Putin's henchmen is the same. They all want to assert themselves. They are all eager to go on a spree, so to speak. But there aren't enough enemies of the people for everyone. And this is, of course, a great sorrow for them. Kremlin, Kremlin, Kremlin. It remains as hopelessly foolish as ever. This is pleasing without a doubt. 3 years and 3 months of war have not added a single ounce of intelligence to the Kremlin. With his statement, an official statement about the decisive role of North Koreans regiments in the Kursk epic, Putin essentially admitted to the tactical and frontline impotence of his army. Yes, you just need to strip away all the chaff, all the pathos, all the unnecessary words, and in the end, you will get exactly that. And to bring down this red-bannered, incurable, and legendary force more than Putin did in the conversation, with his jug-nosed Gerasimov would be absolutely irrelevant. The scandalous admission of Korean involvement, and that it was precisely the Koreans who played the decisive role, although the Kursk region is still far from being completely located. In Russian power, there are quite strong positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. Nevertheless, this admission rips open the trousers of all propaganda and spills the guts of Putin's horde. This statement in general crosses out all of Moscow's assurances about infinity and about the colossal, about infinity, resources, and about colossal combat potential. And everyone sees this. And even the patriots of Russia have already responded to the Kremlin with a mournful cry, collective sobbing, and pleas to remain silent. The revelation is indeed, let's be honest, with each other, the revelation is truly inexplicable and absolutely idiotic. That is, the author of this revelation could be, firstly, well, Putin himself, whose level of intellectual development, well, in general, has always been characterized by a modest height. And naturally, his interlocutor, Gerasimov, of course, graduated with honors from a special school which allowed him to head the general staff. But in general, he still navigates the realities very, very weakly. Perhaps he needs to repeat the course. Well, or maybe most likely his piece of glory was demanded by Kim, who was eager to erect a monument to the Korean heroes who fell for liberation. Of great Russia. But in general, how this whole story came to light is unclear. But it must be understood that intelligence is the most formidable enemy of patriots, and it is precisely this principle that guides them. The Kremlin forms its analytical teams, gathering under the ruby stars in the presidential administration only the most mediocre and convenient individuals. They are also overseen by that ridiculous hack Dugin, which, adds a noticeable staleness to the intellectual activity of the Kremlin's brain apparatus. Listen, I have an amazing, truly amazing video on my Telegram channel. So amazing, in fact, that I had to look into it. Look into it, well, for at least 6 hours. Is it a fake? But as it turned out, no, it's not a fake. It's a completely legitimate, honest video. Not a joke. And it's clear that the closer it gets to May 9th, the more the victory frenzy intensifies. The victory frenzy has already taken on an openly anecdotal character. But the regime is striving for the pinnacle of absurdity. Apparently, there is a need to make the victory frenzy events funnier than Chaplin or Louis de Funès films. Of course, there's a lack of de Funès. Moscow is increasingly bold in exploiting the theme of the USSR's participation in World War II. And it must be said that the Kremlin realized that to hammer rusty nails of that war into people's minds, it needs to be done, as they say, up to the brim. And Moscow is even more caricatured, slavishly, but caricaturedly, copied by Lukashenko. He also embarked on a victory-obsessed rampage. But things are really bad with brains there. And in Minsk, state bodies are implementing a challenge. This challenge is mandatory for all patriotic forces, as well as universities and institutions, to take up. This challenge, in fact, well, not in full, but almost in full, is posted on my channel, as I understand, nowhere else. For example, it consists of different parts. The first part is called 22 Steps in Place and symbolizes the date of the Nazi Germany attack on the USSR. In the second task, participants are invited to spend 10 seconds in the chair pose. Yes. Then the next task is a remembrance of the siege of Leningrad. Here, you need to stand on one leg for 125 seconds with a book on your head to catch the idea of the 125-gram blockade bread ration. The most interesting thing is that both in Russia and Belarus, of course, millions of people have long stopped feeling the sharp scent of this amusing madness. Well, just like a person who has worn dirty socks all their life naturally stops noticing their smell. And now this has become an everyday norm. And it's good that the victory obsession is becoming more and more ridiculous, more anecdotal, and is acquiring a frank character of national delusion. And let's note that the illness, if you've noticed, is undoubtedly and openly progressing. It all started with innocent children's strollers converted into small tanks. It all started with marches and pilot caps. But now it has reached the point of marching on partisan half-bent legs and blockade. 125-second stance. That is, the movement towards chlorpromazine is evident, and it is absolutely unstoppable. But the thing is, the old forms are good only for a while, and then they become tiresome and no longer work. And it's interesting to think about what victory frenzy might look like in the near future. Will voluntary self-burials be practiced? Alive? In mass graves with the grandfathers who fought? And how many years will it take before we see flash mobs? For example, a Vysotsky-style event or attractions called matrosovs with the opportunity to lie under the bullets of a combat machine gun or place relatives there. All of this is inevitable because the vector is something that cannot be cancelled. Remember those same Russian liberals. Liberals in general did everything to instill a distaste for liberalism. They started small, but they did everything so that this word could be forgotten. Starovoitovs, Sobchak, they did everything to instill a strong aversion in the people to liberalism. Now various Milonovs, Volodins, and Gerasimovs are instilling a distaste for patriotism in the people. Of course, they should be thanked for these efforts, but it is known that finally, perhaps this year in some places, to enrich the patriotic palette at the marches of the walking horde, namely the immortal regiment, there will still be portraits of animals that were also participants in the Second World War and either died or passed away after the war from natural causes. For example, reindeer, yes, they carried artillery in the north. In the 14th Army on the Karelian front, there were reindeer-drawn sled teams. There was the famous reindeer Abram, who transported a record number of shells, and reindeer Abram. In the portrait in the immortal regiment, he fits wonderfully into the overall context. So that truly no one is forgotten and nothing is forgotten. Well, and camels, there were also very many of them on the roads of war. In the 28th Army, for example, there were dozens of camels. Near Astrakhan, by the way, there is a monument to the military. Camels, a memorial. And of course, they also perished from shelling. But it's unclear only whether life-size or portraits or bust portraits of camels should be carried in the immortal regiment. How should they look? And who will carry these portraits? Relatives, descendants, or will this be entrusted to third parties? This is completely unknown. But probably these questions will be resolved. Well, that's all for today. I remind you about the possibility to order a book on the origin of genius and fascism, which is probably the only one today that, without sentimentality and complexity, explains what can be expected and what should not be expected from, firstly, today and all the days to come. Also, I already mentioned that they brought the origin of personality, human intellect, and they brought it. Another edition of Asker's art. And that is probably the most important thing for today. All the various details, minor details of the day, which don't make sense to retell, well, firstly, because there are so many videos on the channel you can observe in the Nevzorov Telegram channel. Thank you. Please subscribe to it. Subscribe because it is still, your subscription is a demonstration of the power of resistance. And I suspect that when finally the debriefing begins, you will always be able to boast that during the hardest, most dangerous and fiercest times, you were not afraid and were subscribers of the Nevzorovian channel. That's all, essentially. For today, glory to Ukraine. What's there? Long live Belarus. And I remind you about the political prisoners who are waiting for their exchange and who should not be forgotten, including Skobov and Shaman Gadishev. Goodbye.